So a few months ago, I had a husband and wife stop by. They live up in the Chicago area, and they have an M24 gyroplane, and they were interested in doing a biennial flight review. It's been a couple years since they got their rating, so they're due for a biennial. So they stopped by, and I always, when I do a biennial flight review with people, I always ask them, what is it on the flight portion of it? What is it that you want to do? And remember, a biennial flight review is not a check ride. All right, there's no pass-fail thing. The purpose of a biennial flight review is for the student. All right, and it's to get the student up to snuff operating the aircraft. And as an instructor, your job in conducting biennial flight review is ensuring that the applicant is able to fly the aircraft safely. In a nutshell, that's what the whole thing has to do with, is being able to get people where they can operate the aircraft safely. So when it comes to the flight portion of it, I typically ask people, what do you want to do? And nearly all of the time, the one thing that they've done nearly none of since their last biennial flight review is going to be emergency procedures. And in the case of a helicopter, we do almost the entire time doing auto rotations. And in the example of a gyroplane, we do emergency landings where we go up, we pull the power off. Okay, now you got to get back, get me to a spot that you can get this thing in and get it into a field safely, or back to the runway or wherever. So most of the time on the biennial flight reviews, we'll do practice emergency procedures, which constitutes most of the flight portion of the biennial flight review. So a couple months ago, Bill and Robin Keenan stopped by to do their biennial flight review with me. And of course, when we get to the flight portion, that always begins with a good pre-flight inspection of the aircraft. And I'll show you a quick video of them doing the pre-flight. Notice the appearance of the gyroplane. You're going to see it again later in the video. So Bill and Robin Keegan stopped in to get a biennial flight review. They have a M24, and so we're going to go out and do an hour's worth of flight portion for each of them to get them back up to snuff and current on their biennial flight review. So when we get out there, as luck would have it, I actually did more than, so a biennial flight review is required to have 1 hour ground and 1 hour of flight as a minimum. And as it turns out, we ended up doing, well, probably more like an hour and a half or so with both Bill and Robin doing mostly emergency landings. And most people, if they haven't done an emergency landing in a while, they tend not to keep the speed up good enough in the emergency procedure. And that's kind of how it worked out here. The first few landings tended to get a little bit slow, so you add a little power at the end, to make sure that you're not too slow to flare and hit. But so one of the things you concentrate on is at the very end of the landing, where you're coming in, you've got your field made or your runway made or whatever, is to make sure that you keep that nose down to keep your speed up, so that you have adequate kinetic energy to flare and set the aircraft down. You don't want to be going 30 miles an hour out of the sky and try to flare it. You'll end up hitting hard and can do some fairly significant damage to the aircraft if you hit hard enough, depending on what you're landing on. So. And some of the things that you need to think about when you're making an emergency landing are your choice of fields. If you've got some altitude is your friend. It gives you options to pick out fields. And so one of the things you need to think about, especially around here, we've got a lot of farm fields. You need to think about what crops that you're going to be landing in. Probably the worst one to land in would be corn. How the corn is planted, each of the rows have some deep furrows in them, and even if you land with the rows, if the corn's relatively short and you land with the rows, the wheels can dig into the furrows and actually cause some damage to the aircraft. You can roll it over on its side, the rotor can get into the ground, that sort of thing. So when you land, you always want to land with the rows, but you try to pick the shortest crop you can. Soybean fields are pretty good, they're pretty flat. The best one would be a newly planted wheat field. That's like landing on somebody's front lawn, because they're usually flat fields. And they're very easy. You can almost land in any direction on them, on a wheat field. Rice field is the same way, except for if it's full of water, that's a bit to contend with. But a newly planted rice field that's just sprouting, again, it's flat and it's very easy to land on. Again, you can land on almost any direction. Soybean fields are a little less preferable, but they're still a very, very good option. But you definitely want to land aligning the aircraft with the rows. All right. So I did another video called How to Crash a Helicopter, and probably should have titled it How to Crash a Helicopter and or a Gyroplane, because all of the information that's in that video can be directly correlated to the operation of a gyroplane. And what it has to do with is making an emergency landing where you don't have the best of situations, where you don't have an open field to go into. You're going to have to settle into the trees, or you're in the mountains or whatever. So if you haven't seen that, I'll put a link up for it on here. If you haven't seen that video, it's well worth watching. Be sure and take a look at it. All of the same things apply for gyroplanes and actually airplanes as well. But anyway, it's an RB publication that I reviewed, and if you haven't seen it, be sure and take a look at it. So about 4 days ago, I think it was June 4th, I received a text from Robert Keenan, or actually a message over Facebook Messenger, and I'll show you guys what that looks like here. Okay, so that message indicated that they had a forced landing in the gyroplane, and as you can tell, the picture that's included with it, the gyroplane came out unscathed, as did the passengers on it. And apparently they landed in a bean field. And what happened was the hose on the front of the engine, the M24, the engine compartment is cowled up. And one of the few places that you can't really see very well is what would be the front of the engine, front relative to the aircraft, front of the engine. And what had happened was a coolant hose had come off in that location. So if you're flying a rotax engine, it's not a bad idea on an aircraft that's quite cowled up. I'm going to show you here what it looks like on an M16. It's quite open. You can see it on the open cockpit aircraft, and so it's not really an issue. But on those aircraft, whether it's an M24 or if it's a Cavaline or some other brand gyro that has the engine compartment cowled up, you need to take the cowlings off every few hours, maybe every 10 or 15 hours. Take a look and make sure that that hose is not loose or about to come off. So here on the M16, the hose that tends to come loose here, I'll show you. This is back up. Here's the M16. This is actually the front of the engine. And I'll just slide in here and show you. You can see that hose right there that I'm pointing at is basically the ones that where the hose can come loose and cause a problem. Don't rely on just the annual inspection or 100-hour inspection to take a look at the actual hose and how it's bolted down. As luck would have it, a gentleman that was here had that was here when I received the text or received the message, had a airplane that had a rotax engine in it, and he had actually found his hose about to come off once, and he made the statement he put 2 clamps on it to help ensure that it wouldn't come loose again. So if you're flying a rotax, it's not a bad idea to take those cowlings off and take a look at it more frequently, just to make sure that you're not going to end up losing all of the coolant. I had exactly the same thing happen to me in an M24. It's Murphy's Law. As luck would have it, I had a guy that weighed over 300 pounds with me in the aircraft. I was only about 1.5 miles away from the airport. I had nowhere to go. It had rained. There was nothing but muddy fields everywhere. If I would have tried to do an off-airport landing into a muddy field like that, that thing probably would have kind of stuck and likely would have damaged the aircraft. So I managed to reduce power and limp the thing back to the airport. But so this is not an uncommon thing. So it's well worth taking a look at. So I replied to Robin's text and said, congratulations for doing a good job on the off-airport landing, tailbill. I said, good job. And I also said, look at the front hose on the engine. That may be the hose that came loose when you guys finally get the aircraft where you can take a look at it. A little later in the morning, she sent me a text back that said, bingo. And it turns out that was the hose that had come loose, and I'll show you a picture of that here. Okay, so what did we learn from all this? Well, we learned that emergency landings do occur, forced landings do occur, all right? And you need to be ready for them, okay? When you do your biennial flight review, one of the best things you can do is get together with the instructor that's doing the biennial flight review and let him know, hey, I want to be sure that I can get this thing on the ground. I'd like to do a bunch of emergency landings or in the case of the gyroplane, or auto rotations in the case of the helicopter. If you do that, number one, it's a heck of a confidence builder. You feel like, when you're flying the aircraft, you think, well, if this thing quits, I know that I can get it on the ground. And it makes all of the difference in the world. So stay safe out there, and you guys do those practice emergency landings.